Today on the
Okay.
podcast, we're going to talk about what healthy boundaries do and don't look like. We want to troubleshoot the confusion and frustration that boundaries can bring when they're not working like they should and what to do about it. So, Dr. Kim, to start off the conversation, what are some of the reasons that we might be reluctant to implement boundaries in the first place?
I think there can be some anxiety and some fear in that even, maybe that what if they don't work? Not sure if you can follow through the consequences. Sometimes it's guilt. Okay, we're not going to go to your parents over Sunday for lunch, and that's the best thing for you and your family, but there's guilt there. And I think people think, am I being selfish? So I think we can self-talk a lot of
Mm,
negative things in that, that just keep us from taking that step, because for a lot of people, it is a big step. If you grew up
mhm.
with boundaries and you grew up with a family that used them in healthy ways, it's probably pretty easy for you, but you're really the exception. Most people didn't grow up with knowing how to set healthy boundaries. And so then you've got some things to work through. And maybe it's the fear of just who that person is and how are they going to take that, or how do I communicate this to them. So I think a
Mhm.
lot of things can go into not doing it, and yet that's probably not helping either. It's more, okay, I am fearful about this, acknowledging
Mhm.
that, and what do I need to do to set boundaries, and that's where maybe talking to a pastor or a counselor could really make a difference before you even take that step.
Yeah, that's good. Those are really good. And I think about, yeah, how hard it would how hard it'd be to set a boundary with a parent if you know they're going to guilt trip you, or with a spouse if you think that it might be hard to explain or something like that. It's going to take some work. So I think that's a deterrent right there. Is trying to figure out what the boundary is, how to set it in the first place, how to have the conversation.
And I think if you have that kind of fear, it probably is a good red flag for you of knowing there needs to be a boundary here,
Hmm,
because how I'm feeling about even setting a boundary.
right. That's a great point. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
You know,
And I think you did a lot in our last conversations about setting them and how to set them to dispel like the fears, because really what we've talked about is that they're going to make everything healthier. They help each individual to be healthier and each relationship to be healthier. So I think the message you've been giving us is it's worth the work, even though it is going to take some work.
yes,
Hmm. Yeah, there are a few more reasons that I can think of, that people might not want to set them, which would be just being a people pleaser, being afraid of rejection. You mentioned
mm,
being afraid of seeming selfish or feeling guilty. Or on the other hand, if you don't like to be vulnerable, if you don't like to ask for help, that can be difficult to navigate. And also fear of being hurt if it doesn't go well. Say, for example, you tried to set boundaries before, it was a disaster. You're not going to want to try again. So there are a lot of reasons we might shy away.
absolutely. And I think that's a good point. If you've set boundaries and know that need to be set, it's unhealthy, and it didn't go well, the person didn't accept it. That may help you see that there's another step you may take, and that might be even for a period of time cutting off a relationship.
Hmm.
The only person you can control is yourself, and we've talked
Hmm.
about that a lot. But you've got to remember that in all of these kind of things, just because you set a boundary doesn't mean things are going to magically go the way you want them to. It
Hmm.
may be just a first step, and there may be some other steps, or it may be the step that makes a difference.
Hmm.
But again, you can only control yourself.
Gosh, that's a great point. I think that's really important to note. And like, if we could put that in bold, all caps, like it might not be magic. It might be just the first step.
Yes.
That's really, really helpful information. Because we can't expect that we just throw these out and say, here's the boundary, and then everything whoop just changes. Like you have to navigate relationship in a relational way. So that means there's give and take, and there's learning, and there's process, there's some trial and error. So that's super important.
Well, there's some people that just don't even know what boundaries are, or have
Hmm.
never even looked at it. I mean, they just, we talk about it like it's because we understand them. We talk about it in counseling because people know,
Mm.
but there's people that you may want to set a boundary with, have no clue what a boundary is. So it depends. How do you express that? And maybe it's some communication you have to have beforehand. So yes, it's work. All that's work.
Hmm.
But just think about where you are in the situation, relationship now, where it's not going to get any better if you don't do something,
Hmm.
and it's probably going to get worse over time. Uh, Hopefully that encourages you to say, okay, this is going to be worth the effort.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great encouragement. I think that's really good. So if we're talking about, let's just take for example, the idea of if someone is a people pleaser, if they're listening and they recognize, yep, that's me, or say you say, I, you know what, I hate being vulnerable and asking for help. And in this situation, I would have to be vulnerable and say, it hurts me when you do this. So will you stop? If you're in one of those situations, how can setting boundaries actually help you work through that and become healthier?
Yeah, I think there's a problem when we don't take care of ourselves and our own needs, and so sometimes we do it by pouring into other people because for a
Hmm.
lot of people that gives them purpose, or we want that acceptance, we want a connection, and so we do that at the expense of ourselves, and so we begin to some people measure their self worth by what they do for somebody else, and so I think it's understanding that taking care of yourself is really important. It's a necessity. It's not some luxury that you give yourself. Um, and I think when you get in those, a lot of times those relationships get where they're codependent, and basically you're placing that other person's welfare above yours, and so
Mm.
then you lose yourself, your own needs, desires, and sense of love.
Mm.
And so I think that a lot of it is just realizing it's okay to take care of yourself.
Mm.
Um, you don't have to please other people. Um, the only approval that we really need is God's, and because
Hmm.
He loves you just the way you are. And so, and the other thing I think, when the scripture that talks about loving your neighbor as yourself, and I think that's a really good thing. You've got to love yourself well to love your
Hmm.
neighbor well, and loving
Hmm.
yourself well. Even Jesus, when He was here on earth, take time for rest, took time to be alone, took time to be with the Father,
Hmm.
took time to be with just his closest friends. I mean, he set a good example for us that, he could have been the biggest people pleaser of all time, but he didn't heal
Hmm.
people 24/7. In his
Hmm.
humanity, he took care of himself too, because he knew that was going to
Hmm.
make him healthier to help other people.
Mm. Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. And I think that's such an important reminder in relationships. If we're working for a healthy relationship, we also need to be working for our personal health, and they go hand in hand. They always do, because it's growing both. That's so good. And I love going to the scripture for that as well, because another thing we see with Jesus, when he was on earth, he did not indulge bad behavior. When the Pharisees would try to entrap him with questions or
Yeah.
trick him, or, ask these
Yeah.
things to make him seem guilty, he never played their game. He did not. And so he had a boundary there where he would not indulge that bad or deceitful behavior. And so I love the precedent that sets for us. We don't have to either.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think Jesus was so good at setting boundaries, and he
Hmm.
set the ones that needed to be set. He knew how to be consistent with them. All
Hmm.
those kind of things. He's a great model of setting boundaries in relationships or with unhealthy
Mm.
people. So I'm so
Hmm.
glad you brought that up. That's awesome.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, no better model for sure. And then I think it also brings into a really important point, because when we bring up Jesus as an example, it's a little tricky because he did know everyone's heart and he knew everything and was sinless. We do not have either of those qualities. We're neither omniscient or perfect. And so in marriage, I think it's just a helpful reminder that sometimes we'll need to set boundaries with our spouse because they don't know how they're impacting us unless we tell them. And so that's something I've needed a lot of reminding in my marriage. I would often be tempted to assume, oh, Brian should know how he affects me when he X, Y, or Z, but he can't know that unless I tell him. And so my assumption would be that,
Absolutely.
okay, if he wants to be a good husband, he would do what I want from my perspective. But in the reality, it's a two-way street. And so if I don't like how he's behaving in a certain way, if I'm not happy with something, if something's not working, I have to let him know that. And so that's part of the boundary process, is simply getting on the same page being vulnerable enough to say, hey, this isn't working for me. Can we work together on something different?
Yeah, that's so good. Really good example. And I think too, yeah, when we talked about Jesus being the model, yeah, you're right. We have our humanness, but I think Jesus sets a standard that we want to strive for,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that we're never going to get there, but we don't want to lower the
Mm-hmm.
standard
Mm-hmm.
because we're going to learn from trying to be like him.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. Yeah. All right. So I'm into the conversation. That's pretty powerful stuff, right?
Yeah,
That's so good.
it's good.
Um okay, so we're going to take a little turn here. So what are some of the red flags that you can tell us that show that we're doing boundaries wrong?
Well, I think one of the big ones, and we've kind of alluded to it, that you're focused on getting other people to change. Your focus is
Mhm.
on trying to get them to change themselves. You can ask them. Boundaries are intended to help you get your needs met and to set a boundary that is affecting you, but you can't expect your boundary to change or control other people because it just
Mhm.
you can't. You have no power over that. That's got to be their decision. I think the other thing, I think anytime you set boundaries when you're angry, you're probably going to get in trouble.
Mm.
uh,
Mhm.
Either be too harsh, maybe set a boundary that doesn't even need to be there, but you just do it when you're upset. um,
Mhm.
or they use it as punishment. Then I think a lot of times, which boundaries are not punishment. Boundaries are to make things healthier.
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
when we kind of talked this a little bit earlier, but when you give in, when there's pushback, I think that's one of those things. And so sometimes people back off of doing boundaries. And maybe it's just that you need to think
Mhm.
about it, pray about it, maybe talk to a counselor and come back about it a different way. Because if it's something that's really important and you need to figure out how do I communicate that in a healthy way.
Mhm.
Sometimes I think boundaries can be rigid, and I think usually that is when we're trying to get something that maybe trying to control again. It's
Mhm.
got to be boundaries, got to be realistic. You know,
Mm.
um, I think boundaries also it's sometimes I think we take the negative thing of, okay, this is boundary because it's what I want you to do, but or don't want you to do, but also it's a lot what I want. I want this relationship to be healthy, and you don't want to lose sight
Mhm.
of that. It's I'm trying to make this relationship healthy. That's really the goal here. It's not healthy. I want it to
Mhm.
be healthy. Um, I think too is I kind of alluded to it, but not seeing as punishment that
Mhm.
you can when you're setting boundaries, the goal is to be kind, to be compassionate, to be considerate, but to be firm. Just I think the example you gave of Jesus and the Pharisees,
Mm.
he set a very firm boundary with them. You don't do
Mhm.
this, and so
Mhm.
now when he was turning over tables in the temple, he was probably not being as compassionate and kind because he was very
Mhm.
offended at that time.
Mm.
But it was a righteous indignation. So
Mhm.
I think realizing that boundaries aren't designed to keep people out, that they're really
Mm.
meant to make it easier for people to get close to each other. And I
Mhm.
think keep that in mind. Your goal in most of these is going to try to make a relation healthy and can be everything it could be. There are some people you're going to set boundaries with that just are not healthy, and until they get healthy, there's not going to be keep have a relationship with them or be able to get
Mhm.
close to them. But in general, with the people we're talking about, we want that relationship to be healthy, and the boundaries is a way to help us get there.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. So there's a lot there. Those are really important and a lot of different red flags. And I feel like one that's come up consistently, and
Yeah.
we get a lot of questions about this through our different channels, our email and our direct messages and things. A lot of times it comes down to people wanting to set a boundary that controls someone. And I think that's just how we view boundaries, because we think we can say, my boundary is that you do not XYZ. We cannot make them not XYZ. So our boundary has to be something we can say, if you XYZ, then I will not be able to remain present or whatever it is. And so I think that's a huge one. What are, with all these red flags you listed, how have you seen them play out with the couples you've counseled? Can you give some examples or some tangibles there?
Yeah, I think that with the red flags, I think if you're talking about a couple in marriage, I think it's the whole, you've got to get past the whole deal of this person's trying to control me. I
Mm-hmm.
think in a lot of times in marriage, the boundaries are set out of anger, and so that
Mm.
doesn't go well. And so, like in counseling, we have to reset that, rethink that. Maybe the core of it was something that needed to happen, but because you were angry, it didn't come
Mm.
out that way. It didn't
Mm-hmm.
accomplish what it needs to. And I think too, just that whole thing of realizing that these are to make that relationship healthier. And because sometimes couples will come in and they're just angry with each other. And so the boundaries they're thinking is just, I want you to quit doing this. Maybe some things need to be stopped, but you can't make them stop. We can only decide to put a boundary in there, and what the consequence is if they go there. And then it's their choice. If they continue doing that, then they're going to have the consequences. And so um,
Mm.
I think with couples, it's helping them make their boundaries or set the boundaries in a way that they can both see the benefit. They can both see
Mm.
how this makes our marriage healthier. And then when they're working together to set boundaries outside the marriage that we talked about in an episode, that again, that they're on the same page and they're trying to do those together. So it's helping people not only understand what
Mm.
boundaries are, but understand the best way to set boundaries to accomplish what you want to accomplish. And it's got to be about you and how your life is, not about what that other person does or doesn't do, because that's going to be your cue as to what you end up doing or not doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's really good. I think that's good. You gave us a lot to work on there and to refer back to, because I think it's like you said, like there, if we're stuck on that, oh, you're trying to control me. Well, really, we do share the goal if we want our marriage to be better. I'm assuming in most marriages, I hope you do. And so, if we're going to work together towards that goal, we both have to compromise and give and take a little bit.
Yeah, I think one couple, and it's kind of unique in some ways, but this wife would admit that she had been very controlling, and really just began to see that that's not healthy for my marriage. And I think she read the a boundaries book, and so
Hmm.
she wanted to set boundaries, but we had to work together to help her husband see this is not. She's not figured out a new way to control me.
Mm.
And so again, there's some education that goes into that to help maybe the other person see, hey, no, we're trying to make this relationship better. We're not trying to put you in this mold like maybe she was trying to put you in the past. That's not the
Mm.
purpose now. And so again, it goes back, so much we talk about goes back to communication, understanding, listening, and sometimes having a third party in there like a counselor
Hmm.
can almost say the same things, but because they're saying it, the spouse is going to hear it differently.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Counseling could definitely be helpful for this for sure. So, are there any keys with this to
Yes.
ensure that we are setting a boundary rather than trying to control the other person's behavior?
I think that if you can look at boundaries, I can't remember who I first heard gave this analogy. Maybe Andy Stanley, I'm not sure. We're talking about boundaries being guardrails that
Mm.
you're going to set around behaviors or communication or exchanges, those kind of things, in order to improve the relationship or to keep you safe and healthy. And so when
Hmm.
you're setting a boundary, you're expressing your needs in this clear, direct way. You can't look at them as punitive or controlling, and not look at them as manipulation. And so
Hmm.
um, just making sure a check on that. And maybe that's where I think a counselor can help so much, of
Hmm.
just setting a couple work on boundaries together and keeping them from that. Because I don't know anybody that's been married that hadn't figured out that if my spouse would do things my way, their life would be better.
Right.
There's some of that of thinking, you're my wife, and so you should be doing this or should be doing that. So we got to get past that stuff and
Hmm.
realize that your spouse can be who God created them to be, and you can be who God created you to be. And
Hmm.
some boundaries may help you guys do that in a much easier and healthier way. Yeah, and the goal is
Yeah.
eventually that you don't need a boundary.
Hmm.
That you kind of work
Hmm.
yourself out. You understand that, and it's like, wow, remember when we set that boundary? What was going
Hmm.
on then? I don't even remember, but we don't need that now. And I've seen that happen.
Yeah. Sure.
So I
Yeah.
think those are some things. I think the other things to ensure that it's good, maybe just making sure you're saying it very clearly in a direct, but that it doesn't come off as you're telling them what to do.
Hmm.
And then just to ask yourself, is this going to make the relationship healthier? Is it going to make it safer for you? I mean, really, what is the bottom line? Is this boundary you're setting accomplishing what you feel you need for yourself to accomplish? And
Hmm.
it's going to make the marriage healthier.
Yeah. That's good. That's really good. I think, that made me think of an example that we have shared in a past episode in this series, where we had to have a conversation in my marriage at one point about, and we didn't think of it as a boundaries conversation, which I think there are a lot of instances in marriages where we're having good, healthy boundaries, but not calling them that. And I think that's fine because it's for the health of the marriage. We don't have to frame it in that way. But between Brian and I, because he is a lot more extroverted than I am, we had to have a conversation about when our friends are inviting us to do something and you want to go, but I say, I just really need a night home with our family. We've been out 3 nights this week. Can we stay home? I'd rather not. That you don't then go say, yeah, I wanted to go, but Lindsay said no. And so that stinks. And so we had a boundary conversation
Yeah.
about that. Yeah. It was
Yeah.
not great. I was not enjoying that experience. And he's really good about not doing that. But it was something we had to address at a certain point. Like, wait, let's just be united on this and let's not throw each other under the bus. And it can go the other way too, with like, if there's family events and it's just been a lot in a row. And I don't say, Brian doesn't want to come out. So I think in those situations, we had to address that. But at this point, it's not even a boundary anymore because we've both agreed and come on board. And we wouldn't even do that to each other anymore because we've grown healthier. And I think um, I love that you said at certain points the boundaries might not be needed. Maybe you've just outgrown them, and that could be really encouraging.
Yeah. I think that just shows you that boundary worked big
Mm-hmm.
time to the
Mm-hmm.
point that you got you guys on the same page with something where you don't even need it. That's a great example, I think, where
Yeah.
boundaries can be so good for a relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, that was that was important to me to not look like the party pooper all the time.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I'm trying to think. I don't think I've ever done that. I think a couple of times I've told Nancy when we didn't want to do something, and I said, blame it on me. I don't
Yeah.
care, But that way, I was giving her permission to do
Yeah.
it.
Yes, that's a different story. Yeah. Oh, that's funny.
Yes.
Okay, so moving on, if okay, so we're not in a boundary situation like that. Say it's kind of a tougher one, all right? So if the two spouses have agreed to a boundary, but your spouse is crossing it. You've agreed on it, you already set it in place, they're just not adhering. What do you do then? What can you do?
I think the first thing you do is don't assume that they broke it deliberately. That
Mm,
you may want to revisit it. Now, if this has gone on 10 times, that's different. But say you've just
okay.
agreed to it, and then a few days later that they break it. So I think you want to revisit that and say, hey, remember that boundary set? Let's talk about that. Hopefully they're going to say, oh my gosh, thank you for letting me know. I'm new at this. I'm trying to figure it out. I
Mhm.
really want to honor that, that kind of thing. And so sometimes if they cross it, then maybe you need to redraw the boundary. What is it? What's it look like? Do I need to say it in a different way? And then I think the consequences. What are
Mm,
the consequences? Make sure that you're following through with those consequences. And again, you can't see it. It is as punishment. It is to
mhm,
make this thing healthy. And if you set a bound, the worst thing you can do is set a boundary and then not follow through with it if the
mm,
consequences need to be enforced, because that just you've thrown away all that work. Now
mm,
you decide to set another boundary, you've got to rebuild the credibility, and
hmm,
you're starting, I think, below ground zero when you let those things happen. So I think you want to address it. You want to not assume that they did it deliberately. You want to make sure they understand, talk about the consequences, and then follow through, whatever that is. And sometimes maybe the consequences need to be a little different. Maybe
hmm,
um, I don't know. Maybe walking out of the room doesn't work because they're following you. And so the
Mhm.
consequence is I'm getting in my car and I'll be gone for an hour or
Mm.
whatever till you calm down. I mean, you know, you may have to redo consequences in a way that where they are effective.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. So maybe the consequence is not effective, and so it needs to be revisited.
Yeah. And I think we do that with our kids, don't you? Sometimes you do
Mhm.
uh, maybe a timeout or you take something
Mhm.
away and you figure out they didn't care I took that away. And so
Yeah.
it's like, okay,
Yeah.
I got to find something that is a real consequence with them. You know, I had one mom one time and she said, literally, now in his room is his bed. That's it. I've taken everything else out and he's still not doing what I asked him to do.
Wow.
This was a really smart, strong-willed kid and very
Wow.
determined. So there
Oh
were
my
other issues we
gosh.
had to work on with him, but it was so funny. She would just take one thing away, and she said, literally, today he
Oh my
has nothing.
gosh.
His lamp is gone. His side table is gone. He said, he's
Wow.
got his clothes in his closet. I'm not taking them away. He's got to wear something,
Yeah.
but that's all he's got, and he's just
Ooh.
still, hanging in there. So
Wow.
hopefully his spouse is not that stubborn,
Yes. Yes. I hope not. That would not be fun because, yeah, because thinking of ways to enforce in a marriage is so different than parenting or even with other like outside of the marriage relationships. It's just so different because you're working in a
Yes.
covenant relationship. You're sticking in it together. You're not trying to punish them, but you are trying to make sure that you're acting on these boundaries you're setting.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's where working to where you buy into understanding, both of you understanding the value of boundaries and what they are together really makes a difference because then you can both really be on the same page that these are necessary and they will make our relationship and our marriage better. And so it may be talking to a counselor about boundaries, maybe you read the boundary book together, just help you
Mm-hmm.
understand what they are and how they can be used. Because you're exactly right. In a marriage, one, you're together. And so,
Mm-hmm.
if it's a friend that you're trying to set boundaries with, well, you don't have to see that friend every day, probably. Or it's really easy to set that. Well, when you're in the same bed with that person,
Mm-hmm.
staying in the same house with that person, um, the more you can be on the same page with boundaries, the better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one, this is probably a good place to mention Boundaries in Marriage, the book by Cloud and Townsend. So they're going to go a lot into more detail than we have time for here and give some suggestions on ways to make those things more actionable and forcible.
Yeah, it's probably the kind of the number one book on boundaries. When they came out with that, it was kind of it was just life changing for a lot of people, and they put it in
Mm.
such a well way to help you understand how to do them right.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's important to mention. It's kind of obvious, but we can only say so much here because everyone's context is different. We can't work it all out for everybody, unfortunately. But there's a lot more information available there from a great biblical perspective.
Yes.
Okay, so let's flip it now. So say you have set a boundary with your spouse, but you're the one struggling to keep it and uphold it. What can you do?
Well, I think if it was me and I was probably struggling, I would probably need to really sit with Nancy and have her help me understand why we're putting this boundary in place. Because maybe I haven't
Mm-hmm.
bought in with it, or maybe probably it is. I haven't bought in with it. She sees it's necessary. I don't see it's necessary. So instead of
Mm.
fighting about it, I think you want to go back and sit down and say, okay, I'm having trouble understanding why this is important. I accept it is to you, but can you give me a little bit behind? And then really listen well when they're telling you that. And then empathize, put yourself in their shoes. Okay. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that makes sense of her because of things in her life or because of things that are going on or whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is. That makes sense now. And then I think pray about it. Pray about it together,
Mm-hmm.
pray about it separately. Uh, Father, this is something that's really important to my husband or my wife. I understand that now. I'm still struggling with it. I really need your help in following this boundary, not resenting this boundary, and seeing it. Help me see that it's a benefit to my marriage. So I think it's going to your spouse, getting some clarification, trying to understand, and then putting God in the middle of it.
Hmm. That's good. That's good. And what about is there a place for accountability in this?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that that's good. That's a really good question. I think where is accountability in that? And of course, that's where a counselor comes in. I think really helpful because we'll
Mhm.
talk about something, we'll set something in place. They come back in 2 weeks and we evaluate what worked and what didn't
Mhm.
work, and so you've got some accountability there, which I think helps huge. So, who can be finding someone that you will both be accountable to. And maybe it's me and my best friend that I meet with and we read the Bible together and we pray together. And so that person, when we meet each week, is saying, okay, how you doing with that?
Mhm.
And is praying for you in that same thing. So I think having some accountability, just like in anything, it just helps. If I know
Mhm.
I've committed to something and I know somebody, I got to talk to somebody about it next week, I'm gonna
Mhm.
do it. That's why I give homework and counseling, is because it
Mhm.
helps me know how motivated they are, and hopefully it helps them grow too. It's not just busy work; it's something to help them grow,
Yeah.
and so it lets me know how committed someone is. And so I think it's a same type of thing.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's really good. And I think I can think of situations where we want to be able to hold our spouse accountable in an appropriate way. But in this situation, it seems like you would need a third party for that. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think it depends on the severity. I mean, if this is something where you've got somebody that is yelling at you and you're trying to
Mhm.
stop them yelling at you, and maybe
Mhm.
that's just their culture. Maybe, I've had people that come
Mhm.
from a yelling culture, and to them it's nothing. And then some people it's
Mhm.
an anger problem, it could be whatever it is, but that needs to stop in the relationship because it crushes you. And so
Mhm.
that might be one where you definitely have will need someone else to help your spouse understand and the accountability and help them see how it benefits the marriage. So the thing is, one with the boundary is that you want somebody to hang in there long enough to see that things are better
Mm.
because I'm honoring that boundary than if I didn't honor that boundary. And so you want to give
Mhm.
time for that to happen. Uh, and I think sometimes, people, it just helping people see it's not control. I mean, I think that's where
Mhm.
a lot of people say boundaries and they think, well, they're trying to control me. And
Mhm.
that's not what it's about. And I think
Mhm.
some of that probably has come from people misusing boundaries or calling something boundaries when it really is control. So that's
Mhm.
why it's so important to understand it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think too, I think a lot of it might come from communicating things in a kind of an unclear way, maybe not letting the spouse know this really is important to me. And so going back to you talked about rating things, how important is it? Maybe that's a good place to start. If they know
Right.
this is actually really top of mind, it's very important, it's really getting in the way of our relationship. That would be, I think, more of a motivator rather than it's just some little nitpicky thing that I want to change.
Right. I don't like the way you put the toilet paper on the roll. So the boundary
Right.
is
Yeah.
you have to do that or
Yeah.
I'm going to hide the toilet paper. That's not a boundary. That's not something you do.
That's awful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but that is a good example though. Yeah. Um and I think that gives a good context for actually like what you've told us before is that if our spouse says this is important to me, then it needs to be important to me also. And so we need to learn that when things are super important to them, we need to make them important to us as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then when you're doing that and your spouse is doing that, and it becomes just kind of a habit that you put into your marriage, I mean, that's good stuff. That's going to help you
Mhm.
grow. That's going to help you respect each other more, connect more, and see yourself more as a team. So, and those are all things that we talk about a lot that we want in a marriage relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, I'm glad you mentioned the word habit because we've talked a little bit about how sometimes setting these boundaries, like it's going to be hard to uphold our end of it if we're in the habit of the opposite. And so, what you said about not assuming the spouse did it on purpose or with a negative intention, that's really important because it does take some work to break a habit. And so, if you've set this boundary together, but it's the first time you're trying to enforce it or enact it, it's going to be a little messy at first because of, you're breaking a pattern that you've had. And so, there's just some kind of human nature there to getting through that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. Um, and so it's replacing that habit with a habit that is going to make things better, and
Mm,
hopefully that motivates you. Um, but yeah, sometimes it's hard to break habits.
mhm. Yes. Yeah. But I mean, I think you're right. If they can stick with it long enough to see this as healthy, then that's a great motivator because the reason you're trying to even do this in the first place is because something isn't quite working and you want to have a better situation.
Absolutely.
So let's move on to talking about some pain points. We could talk about abuse or addiction or pornography. If we're trying to help somebody through, let's just say it's an addiction and they have said that we agree, I'm going to change, I'm going to stop this, addictive behavior. How can boundaries help in this situation? Because there's a little more going on there than if it's, how we talk to each other.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this is somewhere where if that is the situation, you really do need a professional at some level, someone who's a drug and alcohol counselor or works in this area, something like that. Uh, because the reason AA works is because people that are in there are the ones who run that have been there before, so they understand it all. And if you're not an addict and you're trying to help an addict and you don't understand that, that can be a big problem. So getting
Mm,
some counsel for someone, but I think you're going to have to draw the lines. You're coming home every night. You're drinking. You stumble. You come home before the kids are up. You don't come, or when the kids are still up. You don't come. You miss dinner, or if you do, you're just slurring your words, and
mm,
so you need to go to treatment. And until you go to treatment, we need you to live somewhere else. That
mm,
those are the kind of tough love boundaries that are hard, but those steps, you can't make the person go to treatment. You can't make
mm,
them even work on it while they're in treatment. I've seen people go to treatment for a couple of months and come back and they didn't go in with the right attitude. They didn't want
mm,
to change. They were just doing this so they get back in the house. And
mm,
so those are hard situations. And I think it's really something that needs to be um, a third party in
mm,
there that is a professional in that area. You mentioned like pornography. Okay, you've been looking at pornography. You promised me you're not going to look anymore. I keep finding evidence that you are. It's not helping your marriage. It's our marriage. It's making me feel like you don't look at me like I want you to look at me as
mm,
your wife. Things like that. And so I need you to go to SA group, Sex Anonymous group, or to go to treatment
mm,
to to help work out of that. And because I can't live my life with you having an adulterous affair with whatever's on the computer.
mm,
So those are pain points. Those are tough
mm,
ones. But there's also if what if you didn't draw that line with the addict? What if you didn't draw the line about pornography? You're going to continue to live in a very destructive relationship. It's not
mm,
healthy for you, your kids. A lot of times I'll see a spouse get out or make that separation because they say, oh, it's affecting the kids. And I've seen women do it and I've seen men do it. I had a
mm,
woman that was an alcoholic and, they'd come home, had come home, the kids that I think the oldest one was 8, they had fixed their own dinner. They'd done this and that
mm.
because she's passed out on the couch again. And so,
Yeah.
it can happen both ways. It's not just
Mm,
the men in those situations. So make sure you're safe.
mm,
Realize what you can and can't do. Get the help of a professional, and then be willing to follow through. Because if your bottom line is to come back home, you've got to go to treatment, and somebody's got to let me know that you are better.
mm,
Then that's got to happen. Yeah,
mm.
or you don't get back in.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's going to be tough, but it's not going to get better on its own.
Well, it's gonna either the person's gonna have a wake up call, which you hope, and so
Mm,
that they would things would get better,
mhm,
or they continue that path, and you have to accept that's all I've done, and I can't go
mhm,
back in that unhealthy relationship. I'm not going to divorce them because I don't feel like
mhm,
that's where I need to be at that time. Maybe you do, but my boundaries are going to stay clear. And you're not
mhm,
going to be around me or the children if you're drinking. I want you to see the
mhm,
kids, but you can't come over drunk. You just can't
Mhm.
do that. And can't make you not drink at all, but I can enforce you not drinking around me or the kids.
Mhm.
And so the boundary may shift a little bit.
Mhm.
Um, and hopefully you continue to pray that that person will get the help they need. And I've seen
Mhm.
people come out of that and see their changed lives and see how their marriage grows. And so it can happen, and God can do that. Those are
Mhm.
just really tough. And I think it's real easy for us to continue to enable an addict uh, because it's easier sometimes, but in the big picture, you're not helping them or yourself at all.
Mm. Yeah, that's true. So this, yeah, this is a place where, there's quite a scale here. We've got, some boundaries that are pretty simple, even though they're not fun. And then we've got some that are really tough, but we've got some little handholds for kind of every step of the way. And I think that it is really important. Like you said, Dr. Kim, if we're in that situation, we're going to need some help. We're going to need a third party, and we're going to need to go ahead and reach out to ask for help in that.
Yep.
Yeah.
And there's some great trained people that will help you.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. So we've covered a lot, and we're beginning to get towards the end of our boundaries series. We have some more good content coming up to continue to make this more specific and precise. But as we end today's conversation about how not to do boundaries, do you have a final piece of advice for us?
I guess I'd like people to dig in and try to understand. Really, make sure you understand what boundaries really are. Whether that's reading
Mm-hmm.
the book or going to a counselor or something like that. Realizing your limitations, know what the red flags are. Just making sure that your boundaries are to make the relationship better, your life better, knowing they're not punishment, and to work with your spouse. It's not magic. It may take some time.
Mm.
Uh, it may take some time, like I could break some habits, but in the big, and if it is a pain point thing, to know that you got to do that. You can't continue to live your life that way. So what I would help is that people kind of look at um, boundaries. Do they need to be put? Um, what good ones? What is a good boundary? Is it not a good boundary?
Mm-hmm.
And what I need to do to make it a healthy boundary, a good boundary, and then you've got to follow through. That's so good. I've had seen people that worked and worked and worked to set a good boundary in place, and then just got pushed back and just gave up. And
Mm.
then a year later, just I can't do this anymore.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to get there. It's worth it.
You don't want to get there, and you don't have to get there. You don't have to. You can
Right.
just stick with it. And of course, any change is hard. Any change you make is going to take some getting used to. But I mean, Dr. Kim, I love you. Just are constantly encouraging us that
Yeah. And I
you've seen things, you've seen marriages be healed and grow and redeemed. So there is always hope there.
Yeah, and I don't think I stressed enough every step of the way, pray. God
Mm,
has an answer. God always has answers that we don't have. And so everything that we talked about today, when you're setting boundaries, you're trying to look at them, are they right or wrong or good or bad or whatever? Pray about it. Ask God's
mm-hmm,
wisdom into that. Ask God's wisdom in how you communicate to your spouse.
mm-hmm,
Really lean on Him. God wants healthy marriages, He wants healthy
mm-hmm,
relationships. So He's
mm-hmm,
going to show up. He just will.
mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so good. That's such a great encouragement. And I love that it's prayer, it's relying on God's provision and his movement, but it's also weird to taking responsibility to be obedient and do what's right in the marriage. So it's his empowerment, his spirit, his will, also our obedient steps of action. So we're not, sitting there praying, God, just make this go away. Because that's typically not how he works.
Right.
Typically, it's a combination of our prayer, seeking him, and then our responding in obedience. So I think we've given some handholds for a lot of ways to do that. And that's a great place to land on with that prayer.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, next week, we're going to be sharing real life examples of boundaries in marriage. We have a lot of stories from our awesome marriage team about how boundaries have helped their marriage in tons of ways. And so I'm excited to share those stories. What kind of what kind of boundaries couples have set, how they implemented them and enforced them, and how it helped their marriage. So make sure you tune in for that. As always, you can reach us anytime at info@awesomemarriage.com or in our DMs on Instagram. We love to connect with you. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us today. Have a great day and do something awesome for your marriage today.